Morning we continue with chapter 18 of the story, Daniel in Exile. Now, if you're new for us, I know there's a few visitors that are here today. We've been working through the story, a condensed version of the Bible, for 31 weeks. We're at chapter 18, starting from Genesis, working all the way through to Revelation and all the stories of the Old Testament, and then the stories of Jesus Christ and letters of Paul. So at chapter 18, we see the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, particularly the stories of the fiery furnace and Daniel in the lion's den. The book of Daniel presents a predicament that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah find themselves in. They are exiles from Judah and sent off to Babylon along with others in their native land of Judah. And they've been carried off away from their homes, their families, their friends, and their homes been destroyed. They now reside in Babylon, where they are prisoners of war and exiled from their homes. You see, the Babylonians conquered people by attacking, taking the best and brightest people away from home, re-educating them and brainwashing them to become Babylonian citizens. I can imagine the intense fear and loneliness and isolation they must have been feeling as they rode off in chariots and away from Judah and off to the land of Babylon. In their exile, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for years, and they were to enter into the king's service, from Daniel 1, verse 5. So the boys were in a foreign land. They were forced to eat foreign food, something they did not want to do and was against their religious beliefs as outlined in the law of Moses from the Exodus. The chief official is there with Daniel and these three boys and asks permission that they could stand their ground, remaining faithful to their God and not defile themselves by eating this food from the king's table. But rather, Daniel and the others offer to say, for 10 days we will eat vegetables and water and not eat the wine and this food from the king's table. This was a test before them to see what would happen at the end of it. And the end of 10 days, they were stronger and more robust men than the others around them. So they won that test by eating vegetables only. And because of that strength of their God and their understanding of faith, the chief official gave the three boys and Daniel new names. So Daniel becomes Balthazar, and Hananiah becomes Shadrach, and Mishael becomes Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. To these four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and to learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kind. God was maturing in them a sense of faith in these young men in the midst of being carried off from their native land of the people of Israel and Judah and off into Babylon, where they knew others. But they were exiled from a foreign place, and God provided them the courage to remain strong and true in their faith of the one God of Israel. God was working out his plans for these young men and asking that they remain faithful in the midst of the horrible circumstances that they find themselves in the exile. Chapter 2 of Daniel involves a dream. And King Nebuchadnezzar must have been up late watching horror movies on TV and eating nachos before bed. And he had these terrible dreams that caused him to stay up all night. And he came to his servants, he came to the people around his cabinet and said, I need somebody to interpret these dreams for me, to find out what they mean. I need to know. And if I can't find out what they need to know, I'm going to put everybody to death and I'm going to cut off their limbs and they will be dead. Well, of course, Daniel is like, hey, hello, I don't want that to happen to me, but I have faithful in a God who is trusting and caring, and I will try to come and help. And meanwhile, Daniel decides he's going to go into prayer. And that night he goes into prayer along with the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego boys, and they all pray to God for wisdom and knowledge and teaching to be able to interpret the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel then went to the king the next day and said to the king, I have the answer. Here's what the dreams mean. And of course, King Nebuchadnezzar was very grateful for his dreams being interpreted. Now he understands them, and he thinks much more highly of Daniel. So why would God have given Daniel the answers to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel? Why would God answer this urgent prayer and provide the answers needed? Why would God have helped them in the midst of these threats from the king? Jeremiah, if you look back to Jeremiah chapter 29 in the book of the story of the Bible, he says this, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and to not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And then you will call upon me and come and pray with me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek and find me when you seek me with all your heart." Jeremiah, the great prophet, says those words in prophesying into the future. But Jeremiah tells us that when we call upon the Lord and come into prayer, God listens to us. God listened to what God's plan was for Daniel. And Daniel went to God for help and advice and wisdom and answered the questions that the king had for him. It was all part of God's plan to prosper these three men and Daniel in their faith so that they would understand that God is a great God who listens and answers prayers. The result of Daniel interpreting the king's dreams says this, "Then the king placed Daniel in a high position, lavished many gifts on him, and made him then prime minister over the entire province of Babylon, and placed him in charge of all its wise men. And at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained in the royal court." The story of these men doesn't stop there. And of course, we now go into chapter 3 with the fiery furnace. They are in a good position within the king's court, but the king, Nebuchadnezzar, insists that all the people under him, all his subjects, bow down and worship. And the king has a statue built representing him that stands 90 feet tall. And all the people of the Babylonian Empire are to bow and to worship to this king. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse. And they stand firm in their faith and saying, "No, I will not bow down to this king or this statue and your king, but I will bow down to my God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the real true God of Israel." And because of their disobedience, the king says, "Okay, throw these men into the fiery furnace where they will surely die." And then the time came where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow, and everyone noticed. They refused to bow to the idol, and they remained true to their God and trusting that God would protect them. And they were thrown into the furnace. At the end of being in the furnace, nothing happened to them. They remained strong, they remained healthy, not even a mark on them after being in that fiery furnace. These three men had incredible faith that God would protect them in the fiery time of their life. And the time that challenged them greatest, God was there for them to keep them safe. That is mature faith like I've never seen before. And then Daniel 3, verse 22 and 23 says, "The king's command was so urgent that the furnace and the flames, that they killed the soldiers who brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to them. So it was so hot, even those people who brought them to the fire died." But at that same time, two things could have happened when they're brought to the furnace. One, the three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, could have become crispy critters inside this hot furnace, or God could do something miraculous. And God did just that. God kept them safe, and God sent an angel in to protect them in the fire. And when the king Nebuchadnezzar saw that they were unharmed, he appointed these three men to a higher position within his army. The king was flabbergasted, and I love his statement at the end of chapter 3. And it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent the angel and rescued the servants. Even Shadrach changed his mind about the true God and decided that he himself would bow down and tell his subjects to bow down to this same God that protected the three boys in the fiery furnace. He made a decree for the people in his kingdom. King Nebuchadnezzar confessed that no other God can save this way in verse 29. I find it a complete miracle that someone who doesn't even know who God is can realize that God is one that you can put faith in. Who believes in God will be safe and out of harm's way. And then sometimes later we move into the story of Daniel. And Daniel finds himself under a new king in the empire, King Darius of Persia. And now we finally hear that story that Daniel in the lion's den is about, that many of us grew up knowing, maybe from when we were young children in Sunday school, or even people who don't attend church, and maybe they're at a stone's throw away from a church, still have heard about Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel in chapter 6, verse 15 and 16 continues the story. Then the men sent a group to the king and said to him, "Remember, O king, that according to the law of Medes and Persians, no decree will edit that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave an order, and then they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king says to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you." And I find it really interesting that King Darius, even himself, wished that God could rescue Daniel from the mouths of the lions. Maybe he wasn't really sure exactly what was going on here completely. Daniel's character and influence had made this foreign king understand the power of God. Here we have a situation similar to the furnace. God can do a few things. He could either let it happen and let Daniel become food for the lions and die in the pit, or Daniel could, or God could do something miraculously and save Daniel from the mouths of the lions. And God does something amazing here. God sends an angel who shuts the mouths of the lions to keep them safe and out of harm's way. Again, King Darius, like Nebuchadnezzar, is amazed by the faith that Daniel has in his one true God. He sends a decree to his kingdom, for he is the living God who endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders of the heavens on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And this king declares to the whole world that God is the eternal living God, that the kingdom must obey and follow that God. Amazingly, the king's faith had changed because of the witness of Daniel being in the lion's den. I wonder if that happens for us in our world. Sometimes when we observe people in faith having miraculous things happen, where their lives are changed because of their faith, where they witness to the love of God and the love of Jesus Christ in their lives, may we also be changed in our faith when we hear those witnesses. The stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel in the lion's den are meant to show us that a maturing faith in our lives can change us, can change who we are, can change our outlook in life, can change how we live. To close, I want you to notice these following things. The first thing is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego matured in their faith to understand that we can no better plan for our lives than to follow the plan that God has lined out for us. As the 4 boys arrived in the land of Babylon, they endured incredible hardship and difficulty. But the entire time they were there, God was maturing their faith. The absolute best way for us is to follow God and following God's plan for our life. The second thing that's noteworthy is Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel matured in their faith to understand that they need to go into prayer. They need to discern with God, to need to pause and listen to God's Spirit, guiding them and granting them the wisdom to make decisions in life. And that can help us as well when we make decisions, rather than going it our own way, but go into prayer and ask God to guide us. The third thing, that the three boys and Daniel matured in their faith to the point that was absolutely a way of life. Faith is not just believing in God, but rather trusting in God to keep us on the straight and narrow, on the way that God has planned for us, to live our faith fully in the world, to live in an action-oriented world where we are living our faith and caring for others and outreaching in the community and helping those in need. Faith is trusting in God. And then the fourth thing is Daniel, Meshach, and Abednego and Shadrach matured in their faith that unbelievers around them noticed. So in a time in our life when we practice our faith and we exercise the love of God through who we are, others will notice. And because in the stories of the three boys in the furnace and Daniel in the lion's den, even the kings changed their ways and changed their beliefs, that it is possible when we go about our world, when we practice our faith and live that calling, that others may hear it and others may observe our witness to the love of Jesus Christ, the love of God in our hearts and in our lives, that we may be a witness to God's love for all the world to see. Our faith is meant to be shared with actions, and the best way to do it is through demonstrating our trust in God wherever we are. Thanks be to God. Amen.